Hello, my little strawberries. Welcome to economics. We're going to finish up Unit 1 with our third chapter, which basically talks about why trade is good and the benefits of trade. So, we're going to look at why people choose to be economically interdependent, why they trade with each other, how trade does make us better off, and then we're going to learn about concepts like absolute and comparative advantage. All right, so interdependence is where we rely on people from around the world to provide us goods and services we enjoy. Think about everything you have on you right now, whether it's your clothes or if you have a drink or shoes or phone, whatever. They're from all over the place. You didn't make them. We buy them from not only throughout the country, but throughout the world. So interdependence reminds us of our principle from chapter 1 that trade can make everybody better off. So we're going to learn how and why. This class is not just about like when we learn things, it makes common sense. It's just, oh yeah, that makes sense. But there's actually some math to it. You can see the actual. So for those of you who like to see numbers and need to see that, we will see that. That's the science part of our class. But there's also the common sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Of course, it's easier to trade. Of course, it's good that I'm not making my own clothes or growing my own wheat. It's better for that. So remember, we use assumptions. We're going to make life a lot easier just to make these complex ideas very simplified. So we're going to assume in our situation that we only trade with Japan, and the only two things that both Japan and the United States make are computers and wheat. And the only things that we use for that is labor. Okay. So we're going to look at how much both goods each country produces and consumes, and if the country would be better being self-sufficient, or would it be better if they traded with each other? So we're going back to production possibilities frontier. We're going to use the one we already used with the US. We have 50,000 labor hours. Producing one computer takes 100 hours. Producing 1 ton of wheat costs 10 hours. So going back, this is from chapter 2. It's that same curve. This is that production possibility frontier where this line right here represents any point on this line is the United States being efficient using all of our resources, in this case, labor hours, to make as much wheat or computers as possible. Now, without trade, let's suppose that we would go halfsies on this. If we just did not trade with anyone and we're self-sufficient, we would just produce these two goods at halfsies, at 250 computers, 2,500 tons of wheat. Now, I want you guys to use the following information to make a production possibility curve for Japan. I'll pause it, and then you pause it too, and then once we're done, we'll go over it. I want to see how you guys did. Okay, so your graph should look something like this, where Japan produces about 240 computers and can produce or if they put all of their eggs in the wheat basket, they could produce 1,200 tons of wheat, or any combination in between. But that's what your graph should be looking like. Now, let's say Japan decides to be self-sufficient too and doesn't trade with us, and they go halfsies as well. That would put them at 120 computers and 600 tons of wheat. So without trade, the United States consumes 250 computers and 25 tons of wheat, and Japan consumes 120 computers and 600 tons of wheat. So we will compare consumption without trade to consumption with trade. Let's say they decide to trade. But first we need to see how much of each good is produced and traded by the two countries. All right. So let's look at this. You're going to do another thing where you're going to pause. You're going to read this question and then read these two questions, figure out the answers. I want you to pause, and then once you've done all your work, you can unpause and look on and see what the answers are, okay? So pause it now, work on it, play it, and you'll see the answers. Okay. So we're supposing that the United States produces 3,400 tons of wheat, and Japan produces 240 computers. So this is the U.S. If they produce 3,400 tons of wheat, they will be able to still produce 160 computers. If Japan produces 240 computers, remember that takes up all their hours, so they wouldn't make any wheat. So let's say they decide to export and import goods. So if you're exporting, you're sending your goods are exiting the country and they're coming in if it's an import. So now that we know these numbers, let's say that's all they produce. Let's suppose they do try to trade. So this is what you're going to do. You're going to pause the video again after doing this. Suppose that the US exports 700 tons of wheat and Japan imports that, and they import 110 computers from Japan, which means that Japan's getting rid of those. How much of each good would the US consume, and plot that on the graph? How much of each good would Japan consume, and plot that on the graph? So pause it, do the math, come back to me. Okay, here are the answers. So let's assume you need to start out with the original numbers. So the original numbers were that the United States would produce 160 computers and 3,400 tons of wheat. So let's assume that they import 110 computers and no wheat, and they export 700 tons of wheat and no computers. So you have to do the math with that. You'll see that they'll have 270 computers and 2,700 tons of wheat. And if you plot that on the graph, as you will see, it's above what they could produce on their own. Remember, the production possibilities frontier is what they can produce on their own with their resources. They are getting more resources for both, okay? That means that they are better off with trade. Let's see, how about Japan? You're going to do the same math. Start with their original numbers, 240 computers, 0 tons of wheat. They export 110 computers. They import 700 tons of wheat. You plot that on the graph and look at, they are, with trade, they have way more than they could have produced on their own. So this is an example of everybody is better off with trade. So it makes both countries better off. Look at the gains that each country gets from trade in all 4 categories: computers and wheat for the US, computers and wheat for Japan. All of them, you're seeing gains from trade. So where do these gains come from, and where do they get these numbers, and how do they know? How does Japan know it would be better to produce more computers than to produce wheat? We're going to look at that too. So these gains come from things called absolute and comparative advantage. So absolute advantage is the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. So basically, you're going to look at the numbers and see who has more, and whoever has more, that's absolute advantage. It's really quite simple. For instance, it doesn't take the US as long to produce wheat as Japan, so they can produce more of it. Therefore, they have the absolute advantage. It's really quite simple. So which country has an absolute advantage in computers? Well, in this case, the US does again. They technically can make more computers than Japan does because it doesn't take them as long to make computers. So they have the absolute advantage in both goods. So why in the world would Japan specialize in computers? Why wouldn't they just make the US specialize in anything? Remember, we need to trade. So we can't really base things off of absolute advantage. You have to base it off of what's known as comparative advantage. So I'm going to skip that one. So comparative, because I kind of just explained it. So comparative advantage is the ability to produce a good at the lower opportunity cost than another producer. So which countries, and this is what we need to understand, who has the comparative advantage in producing these things? And to answer this, you must determine the opportunity cost of a computer in each country. So here's what we're looking at. So the opportunity cost of a computer is 10 tons of wheat in the US. So for every computer that we make in the US, it costs us 10 tons of wheat. For every one computer that Japan makes, it costs them 5 tons of wheat. So they don't have to give up as much wheat as the United States does to make a computer. So I want you to think about that. You're like, okay, if I make a computer, oh my gosh, the United States has to give up 10 tons of wheat, but Japan's like, well, we only have to give up 5. It's not really costing us that much. We're not really giving up that much. So we might as well, why don't we be the ones that make the computers? And that's how they do it. Now there's a formula for this, and I want you guys to write this down. I'm going to hold it up. This is me being very technologically advanced to give you guys this formula. Okay, so the way that you figure out this, you look at each country's goods, okay, and you say the opportunity cost of product A, which we'll say is computers in this case, is B over A of wheat. The opportunity cost of B, which in this case would be wheat, is A over B of computers. So what you're going to do is you're going to get numbers, okay? We already got those numbers previously. I'm going to scroll back up. Scroll up. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Telling you this mouse has me going backwards. All right. So when we looked at before they traded, they decided how much to produce. In this case, you've got Japan producing 240 computers and the US creating none, or no wheat, excuse me. And then you saw the US chose to produce 160 computers and 3,400 tons of wheat. That's the numbers that you'll use when figuring out opportunity costs with those formulas. And you're going to be practicing this a lot over the next few days because this is a pretty difficult concept to grasp in this class. But as long as you use those formulas, it's actually really simple. So I'm going to keep going down. So comparative advantage, the gains from trade arise from comparative advantage. You can't use the absolute because then the US would make everything and that just doesn't make sense. So you want people to specialize in a good that has the comparative advantage, and then that makes the economic pie, meaning like the GDP, the value of all the goods and services in the world, bigger, and then that gives us a better standard of living. And the same applies for individual producers who benefit from trading with each other. So we actually are going to look at Farmer Frank and Rancher Rose, and you're going to see how what they produce, the benefits they have with just trading one-on-one rather than like a large country. All right, so I want you, using those formulas I just helped you with, this is what I want you to do. Do this problem. Argentina and Brazil each have 10,000 hours of labor per month. In Argentina, producing 1 pound of coffee requires 2 hours. Producing 1 bottle of wine requires 4 hours. In Brazil, producing 1 pound of coffee requires 1 hour. Producing 1 bottle of wine requires 5 hours. Which country has the absolute advantage in producing coffee? And which country has the comparative advantage in producing wine? So pause it. Try this using the formulas. I'm just going to give you a clue. When it comes to using those formulas for comparative advantage, you're going to have to use them twice because you got to use it for Argentina and Brazil. You have to find out for both of them. So once you've done that, you can compare the two and find out who has the comparative advantage. So pause your video and we'll come back and do this, look at the answers together. Okay, so let's look at these answers. So as you can see with the numbers, Brazil did have the absolute advantage in creating coffee because they only had to use 1 labor hour, but Argentina had to use 2 labor hours to do that. So Argentina has the comparative advantage in creating wine. So I want to show you guys something. Let's see if I can do this. This is my first time doing this. Oh, I don't want to really use that. Let's see if I can bring up. Nope, I can't do that either. Okay. So I'm going to pause for a second and I will have something typed up for you to put on here, okay? Okay. Read along while I show this to you. All right, so what I did was I figured out what you should have done is figured out how many coffees and how many things of wine Argentina and Brazil can make. And once you did the math, which was they had the 10,000 labor hours and how many they could make per hour, you should have gotten 5,000 coffees and 2,500 bottles of wine for Argentina. And for Brazil, you should have gotten 10,000 coffees and 2,000 bottles of wine for Brazil. So what you were to do now is you needed to figure out the comparative advantage, who had the comparative advantage of wine, Argentina or Brazil. So you use that formula I gave you before. The opportunity cost of A is B over A of B and vice versa. but you have to do it 4 times because you got to do it twice for each country. So first you do Argentina. So the opportunity cost of coffee, and you just, go to its lowest denomination, would be half a bottle of wine, where the opportunity cost of wine would be 2.5 pounds of coffee. In Brazil, you do the same math because you're using the numbers up top. The opportunity cost of coffee is a fifth of a bottle of wine, where the opportunity cost of wine is 5 things of coffee. So basically, you're seeing who gives up the least amount of stuff. And we're looking at wine. So what you're going to do is you're going to look, since we're looking at wine, you got to look at this one and this one, where Brazil's like, I'm giving up 5 things of coffee to make a bottle of wine. And Argentina's like, well, I don't have to give up as much coffee. I only give up 2.5 pounds of coffee, where you give up twice as much. So I should be the one making the wine. So that's why Argentina has the comparative advantage to make the wine, because it doesn't cost them as much coffee. They don't have to give up making as much coffee as Brazil does. So that's why they have the comparative advantage. Does it take you a while to do the math? Yeah, but once you do that, it's really not that bad. You're just like, oh, I don't have to give up as much to make a product, therefore I should be the one making it. You have to give up way more. So that's it. I'm just going to go over that for today. I'm not going to go over the end. We're going to, over the next couple of days, practice this a lot. And the more you practice it, the easier and easier it gets. I know it's a difficult concept to understand, but again, using those formulas, practicing it, I promise you'll get through it. Have a good one.